In chapter 34, we're going to be looking at the reproductive system. We're not covering all of chapter 34, just focusing on the male and female reproductive system and the menstrual cycle in females. So first of all, just introducing quickly the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction only requires one parent, and the offspring are genetically identical to that parent, and uses the process of mitosis, in which one cell divides to make two. So again, only one cell is needed, and offspring are genetically identical. Whereas in sexual reproduction, the new individual is formed from the union of two different cells. These cells are called gametes, so egg and sperm. For example, they're both examples of gametes. They come together, but they are in fertilization, but they're made by a process of meiosis in sex organs called gonads, so like the testes and the ovaries. The union of the egg and sperm, though, to make a fertilized cell, that fertilized cell is called a zygote. And then in us, invertebrates, that zygote then divides by mitosis to form the multicellular organism. So asexual reproduction only needs mitosis, whereas sexual uses meiosis to form the egg or sperm, the gametes. Once they fuse, then mitosis is used for cell division. All right, so focusing first on the males. So sperm, of course, are the cells that the reproductive cells or gametes that they make. Now, a little tidbit here about those: sperm actually do not develop or complete their development at normal body temperature, which is 37 degrees. So inside the testes, which is that sperm producing organ, inside of the sac of the scrotum that actually hangs down, the reason for that is intentional. Allowing it to hang from the leg allows the temperature inside the scrotum to be about 3 degrees cooler than the rest of the body, and that allows sperm to develop. So individuals who are trying to get pregnant, a few things that males can do to increase sperm count and development, and that's one of those, is just keeping the scrotum and the testes cooler to allow for proper sperm development. So looking at the reproductive organs in the male, of course, starting here with the scrotum, which is that sac again hanging below the legs to allow the cooler temperature. Inside of the scrotum is the testes, where the sperm are actually going to be made, and then they're released into what's called the epididymis, that's shown here. Let me switch my color. So then the epididymis, so the sperm will move through there, and then they'll go along what's called the vas deferens. Kind of map it along here a little bit, and then once we get here, you'll also see the seminal vesicle. It's going to release some of the fluid that helps them into this ejaculatory duct. That's going to allow that fluid in the sperm to come together. The prostate gland is on the outside of that, just underneath of the bladder that's here. And then the sperm and the fluid from the seminal vesicles come together here in this ejaculatory duct. And then it comes down. There's also a bulbourethral gland that's here. That's going to join in with our sperm, and then ultimately coming out the urethra to the end of the penis for ejaculation. Now in the testes, again, lots of different compartments inside that we'll see coming up in the next picture, but ultimately each compartment has a bunch of tightly little coiled tubes called the seminiferous tubules, and this is where spermatogenesis occurs. So genesis, creation of the sperm. So the process of making sperm is called spermatogenesis. And this process begins in what are called germinal cells that are on the outside of the seminiferous tubules. And then as the cells go through meiosis and start to develop, they move toward the lumen, or the opening of that tubule. So you can see them here. So again, inside of the testes, here we have these tightly packed compartments, and inside each compartment, these tightly packed seminiferous tubules. Then if we kind of blow up that seminiferous tubule, again, what you'll see is here on the outside, that's where the sperms start developing. And then as they mature, they reach into the lumen. And if we kind of blow that up a little bit. So again, here's one of these germinal cells. They're diploid, meaning they have 2 of every chromosome, one from the mom, one from the dad. So it's going to start developing, going through what's called meiosis 1, which is where we get a primary spermatocyte. That primary spermatocyte then goes through that meiosis 1. That makes a secondary spermatocyte. So originally we start out with 2 of each chromosome, diploid. After meiosis 1, those cells are now haploid. They only have 1 of each chromosome, but they're still duplicated. So we need to separate those chromosomes. So that's what happens during meiosis 2. So those secondary spermatocytes become spermatotids and are now haploid, and now they're ready. They're gametes that are now ready to be released, and they're now called spermatozoa. And again, they're released here into this lumen or opening that allow them then to move ultimately toward the penis for ejaculation. Now the epididymis that we mentioned a little earlier, so after those sperm cells are formed, then they move down that long tube called the epididymis. The sperm cells are not motile whenever it first gets there, so it actually takes about 18 hours before the flagella or the motility is developed. So it kind of hangs out there. Once it becomes motile, after about those 18 hours, then from the epididymis, it goes through that long tube, and then it goes to another tube called the vas deferens. That's the longer route that it's going to take toward the penis. And then once it's ready for ejaculations from the vas deferens, it'll move out through the urethra to exit the penis. I'm looking just at the human sperm cell. Again, this motility is provided by the flagella that allows it to move. The nucleus is here in the head region. There are a lot of little mitochondria right below the head in what's called the body that provides energy to work that flagella that allows motility. Now a little bit about the penis. Of course, this is the external tube that has 2 long kind of cylinders of spongy tissue. Below and in between them, there's a 3rd cylinder of spongy tissue that has the urethra in the center. That's actually where the sperm would come out of. So again, all of the spongy compartments of spongy tissue is designed to inflate. So whenever the nerve impulses from the central nervous system, that causes the arterioles, or back to our cardiovascular system, the arterioles are smaller arteries that leads to that tissue. And essentially as the blood collects in all of those spaces, that's what's going to lead to the erection. So again, continued stimulation fills more of that spongy tissue with blood in those arterioles and allows that erection to continue. So again, looking here, so again, lots of spongy tissue here on both sides. And then our urethra is going to come down through the middle. But again, if we kind of take a cross section through that, we'll see, again, 2 larger spongy tissue areas and then a smaller one, just a smaller piece of spongy tissue that we can see right in here. Again, that kind of covers or surrounds the urethra area. All right, so just a little bit more about the erection. So it can be achieved without physical stimulation. However, physical stimulation is required for semen to be delivered. So an erection does not always mean ejaculation. So again, some type of physical stimulation is needed for ejaculation to occur. So stimulation, such as repeated thrust into the vagina, leads to the first mobilization of the sperm. So the muscles encircling the vas deferens, again, that's the long tube, the sperm travel down to get to the urethra. It contracts, moving those sperm through the vas deferens to the urethra. And then stimulation finally results in a strong contraction at the base of the penis that results in the ejaculation. And that's about 2 to 5 milliliters of semen containing the sperm that's released. And then the semen is just that collection of sperm and secretions. So again, a few of the different glands we mentioned when we were going through it are releasing secretions or fluids. So the seminal vesicles, also the prostate gland, they just help provide energy. So kind of some fuel, some carbohydrates, some energy to allow those sperm, because again, the sperm have a lot of those mitochondria in there, but they need carbohydrates to keep them going. So some of those secretions have that fuel for them. And again, several 100 million sperm are actually contained within that ejaculation. So males with less than 20 million sperm per milliliter, again, about 2 to 5 mils are typically released, but less than 20 million are considered sterile. So sterile doesn't mean that no sperm are being produced. It just means that sufficient amounts are not being produced. All right, now moving into the females. So the eggs are developed in the oocytes, and those oocytes are contained within the ovaries. So we have testes in the male, ovaries in the females. So these oocytes that'll ultimately lead to egg formation, they're needed for a lifetime, or all that's needed for a lifetime are actually present at birth. So we're not continuing to develop oocytes. Actually, at the time of birth, all the oocytes are made. Just during each reproductive cycle, one or even a few of those actually continue their development. So they stay immature, some of them for the entire duration of the female's life, but then others are set to mature, and that process of maturation or maturing is called ovulation. All right, so looking here at the female reproductive tract, so again, we have our ovaries up here. That's where those oocytes would be from, again, birth. But then if they're stimulated to mature, and then the egg actually gets released or goes through ovulation, it'll travel through the fallopian tube, kind of lose it here behind, but then it drops into the uterus, and then from the uterus, again, this is where fertilization would occur. So the male would travel, or the sperm would travel up the vagina through the cervix, and then into the uterus, where again fertilization could occur. All right, so with our oocytes, so at birth, again, we have about 2 million oocytes that have started that first meiotic division. So again, they're going through meiosis, meiosis 1, and then 2 to become mature. So at this point, just as they're starting into that, they're referred to as primary oocytes. So we had kind of a similar thing in the males. So each primary oocyte, though, waits to receive proper signals to continue meiosis. And those signals are follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that we'll talk a little bit more about here after a bit. And then only a very few actually receive that. So again, we have 2 million oocytes. Typically only one is released for each menstrual cycle. So many of those oocytes will never develop or be triggered to finish meiosis. All right, so during the onset of puberty, females are going to start to mature sexually, and really what that means is that there's the first release of that follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that initiates the continuation or the resumption of meiosis in a few oocytes. Again, not all of them, but some of them are triggered to finish going through meiosis. So again, in humans, only a single oocyte continues to mature, and then the other ones just kind of regress. And just kind of putting some numbers here, only about 400 of those 2 million will actually ever be ovulated. All right, so if we look at this again, so there's germinal cells, again, those are diploid, they have 2 of each chromosome. That's going to develop into a primary oocyte. All of this is happening here inside of the ovaries. So that primary oocyte will start to go through meiosis, but again, it just kind of hangs out here at birth. So all of those primary oocytes are there at birth. They're just kind of hanging out here in this stage here. But then if they are stimulated by the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, then they start developing, are triggered to develop and finish meiosis. Now, what happens, interestingly enough, with females is that whenever that cell divides, it does not divide evenly. So we get one larger cell and one smaller cell, and that smaller cell is called a polar body. It is actually going to be destroyed. So both of those will finish meiosis, but they're so small that they don't have enough organelles to support them. So they're actually going to go through apoptosis. Now, the larger cell made during meiosis 1 is called a secondary oocyte. It only has one of each chromosome, but still duplicated. So it needs to go through the second round, so meiosis 2. Again, that division is unequal. We have a larger cell here called the ovum, and then we have another polar body that is too small to survive. So it's going to go through apoptosis. So for every one primary oocyte, we're only going to get one ovum. Unlike sperm, where each primary spermatocyte produces 4 sperm. Okay, again, because there's this unequal division of the cytoplasm, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. All right, then during ovulation, it is actually going to rupture from this follicle, and that would be our secondary oocyte at that point. All right, so once it's released, it then travels down the fallopian tubes or uterine tubes, oviducts, a couple different names there, but that's going to transport the egg to the uterus. Again, the cervix, though the uterus kind of narrows as it starts to exit, and there's this muscular ring that's there called the cervix. Also, the uterus is lined with stratified epithelial membrane called the endometrium. So individuals that have endometriosis, that's kind of an inflammation or infection that can occur in that lining of the uterus. Now, what happens during menstruation, though, is that outer layer actually gets shed, and that's what leads to the bleeding that occurs during the menstrual cycle. Now, during fertilization, when that first sperm cell penetrates the oocyte, a few things happen. So first of all, the oocyte is going to block any other sperm from entering, and then only at this point, after the sperm has actually penetrated, does the oocyte complete meiosis 2 to actually form that fully developed ovum. So again, complete development of that egg cell doesn't happen until it's fertilized by the sperm. So whenever that female haploid nucleus joins with the male, now we have a fertilized egg, and now it's termed a zygote. It then attaches itself to that endometrial lining, that's called implantation, into the uterus, and that allows it to continue to develop. So then, again, what happens is actually in the oviduct. So again, here are ovaries. The egg gets released down the fallopian tubes through these oviducts. It's actually in this region here that fertilization typically happens, where the egg and sperm actually come together. So here our sperm is coming together. It penetrates into or fertilizes the egg. Again, at this point, it is going to finish meiosis 2. We'll see that first polar body that's here. It's actually in there. It's going to become absorbed by the larger polar body inside of the egg. And then we actually get maturation and complete formation of that egg cell. But again, that fertilization is actually happening here in the oviducts of the fallopian tube. And then if fertilized, then it implants into the uterus. All right, so now looking at the menstrual cycle in the female, again, reproductive cycle called the menstrual cycle, we have two different phases. The follicular phase, this is when the egg is actually reaching maturation to become ovulated. And then we have the luteal phase, which is where it's preparing for pregnancy. And these are coordinated by our endocrine system, so different hormones that are ultimately produced and released by the hypothalamus. All right, so starting first with the follicular phase, this is about 0 to 14, the first 0 to 14 days of the reproductive cycle. That anterior pituitary starts the phase by releasing follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone in just small amounts. So initially, lots of those follicles, which is an oocyte and its surrounding tissue, it is stimulated, excuse me, to start to grow. And then as that follicle is secreted, that follicle begins to secrete the hormone estrogen. So the follicle itself that's surrounding that oocyte is actually what's releasing that estrogen hormone. So estrogen, so the low but rising levels act as negative feedback. So it goes back and tells the anterior pituitary to decrease the follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone. This ensures that only one oocyte matures and that another one isn't stimulated to do so. So that, again, rise in the estrogen signal, again, estrogen is released from the follicle itself, it actually ends that follicular phase. Then we move into the luteal phase, which is the last kind of 14 days, so 14 to 28 days of the reproductive cycle. So now we have higher levels of estrogen. Now they start to have a positive feedback effect on the follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone secretion from the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. So the surge or increase in luteinizing hormone is what causes ovulation to occur and that follicle to burst. Then that follicle is released into one of the fallopian tubes, and that luteinizing hormone then directs the repair of the ruptured follicle so that it fills in to become what's called the corpus luteum. Okay, then another hormone here, progesterone, it gets secreted by that corpus luteum, and that also is going to inhibit the secretion of follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormones. Progesterone completes the body's prep for fertilization. That also includes the thickening of that endometrium, the lining of the uterus. So if fertilization does not occur, then that progesterone slows and eventually stops. Then the decreasing levels of progesterone is what causes the thickening of the endometrium to be sloughed off, and that leads to the menstruation and the bleeding that occurs about midway between successive ovulations. Right, so if we just kind of look at what all is happening here, so if we look at our luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating, so at 0 days, again, the follicle stimulating hormone is higher. Again, it's going to start decreasing here to where it's down about midway. And again, that's due to the estrogen that's increasing. So as estrogen increases, follicle stimulating hormone decreases. Now, what happens is whenever that estrogen level gets high, that gives positive feedback that's going to increase the luteinizing hormone. It's going to increase that. It also increases the follicle stimulating hormone a little bit, just not quite as much as the luteinizing hormone. But that increase or surge of luteinizing hormone, that's actually what's going to trigger ovulation. So that ends the follicular phase, and then it starts the luteal phase. So luteinizing hormone, that surge starts the luteal phase. Again, that's what triggers ovulation. So then as it repairs, we get this corpus callosum, and it is, or that corpus luteum, and it's going to cause an increase in progesterone. So that happens after ovulation. So luteinizing hormone kind of triggers ovulation. then that corpus luteum that's left over after ovulation, that's going to increase the progesterone levels. And then as those levels get to the top, again, we're thickening that endometrium layer you can see here. And then as the progesterone starts to decrease, as estrogen gets a little surge again, that's going to mark the sloughing off of that thickened endometrium that leads to menstruation if fertilization does not occur. All right, now, if fertilization does occur, especially high in the fallopian tube, then the zygote's actually going to go through a few rounds of cellular division called cleavage while it's still moving down the uterus. So once it reaches what's called the blastocyst stage, it'll actually implant in the lining of the uterus. And that embryo that's developing secretes a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, and that maintains that corpus luteum, and it prevents it from rupturing and making the progesterone, and it prevents that menstruation. So it keeps the lining thick to allow implantation, but it doesn't slough it off to cause menstruation. So because of that human chorionic gonadotropin, because it comes from the embryo and not from the mom, that's what's actually tested in the pregnancy. So that's what is used in pregnancy tests, because again, only the embryo creates that. So it's positive whenever the embryo is present.